Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the quantitative methodology chapter. Just before we get started with the presentation today, I'd like to present you with some information. If you would like to contact us, if you're interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do offer full assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in additional one-on-one support outside of this webinar, you can use the information on your screen here to contact us and learn more about the services that we provide. So first, I'm just going to give an overview of what we'll be covering today. Today's presentation is on the quantitative methodology chapter. So we're just going to be focusing on quantitative methodologies today. We won't be discussing qualitative. And first, we'll discuss what the purpose of the methodology chapter is and why it's important to the dissertation. And then we'll go in depth and discuss each of the components that should be included in the methodology chapter. So going from the introduction to the research design, population and sample, instrumentation, data collection and analysis procedures, limitations and ethical considerations. And then after we've covered all of the components, we'll have time at the end to answer questions. So if you do have questions, you can type those into the question section, and then any questions or issues that aren't addressed during the presentation, we will have time at the end of the presentation to answer those. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter. So the purpose of the methodology chapter is to describe how you are going to be conducting your quantitative research project. The preceding chapters of the dissertation, so namely the introduction and literature review chapters, are aimed towards establishing why you are conducting your research. Once you get to the methodology chapter, your aim is to describe how you're going to be conducting the research. So the methodology should be detailed enough so that your research can be replicated by others. So someone should be able to read your methodology chapter, and if they wanted to, they could conduct the research study in the exact same way as you did, or you are proposing to do. So you want to approach the chapter as a sort of instruction manual. So you are writing an instruction manual for how to conduct this particular research project. Others will liken the methodology chapter to a recipe, where you want your recipe to be as detailed as possible in listing out the specific components or ingredients that you need and the specific steps that you need to conduct in order to carry out that recipe. And you want that to be as detailed as possible so that others can follow your instructions or your recipe and be able to replicate exactly what you're doing. And while in this presentation, we will be discussing the components that are typical of the quantitative methodology chapter across most dissertations, you do want to double check your specific school or program guidelines to determine exactly what you need in the chapter. We'll be going over the components that are typical. However, your school or specific degree program may require more sections or may require fewer sections, or it may require sections that are slightly different from what we describe here. So you do want to make sure that you defer to your specific school requirements when writing the chapter. So now let's talk about the specific components of the chapter and what you need to include. The chapter typically starts with a simple introduction where you reorient the reader to the purpose of the study and the research questions, and then you outline the section of the chapter. So you just want to simply restate the problem or purpose statement. This can either be an abbreviated version of the problem or purpose, or some schools may even want you to restate this verbatim. And then you want to restate the research questions and hypotheses. And it's worth noting that these should always be stated verbatim wherever they appear in your dissertation. So however your research questions and hypotheses are written in your previous chapters, they should appear the exact same way in your methodology and in other chapters. So the wording of those should be exactly the same every time they appear. And then after that, you just outline the sections that will appear in the chapter. And this can be just as simple as listing out the different section headings that are going to appear in your methodology chapter. Typically, after the introduction, you talk about the rationale for the research design. So in this section, you want to state the specific research design that you have selected. So for a quantitative study, this could include correlational, experimental, quasi-experimental, causal comparative, or others, and explain why you selected that particular design. So you want to give specific rationale for why you chose one research design over others. And this rationale should be explained in terms of your specific problem, purpose, research questions, and hypotheses. So for instance, if you are doing a correlational study, your rationale for that might be that your research questions and hypotheses are geared towards looking at relationships between specific variables. So that's when a correlational study would be appropriate. You will also want to explain why you picked the design that you chose, in addition to why other designs were not selected. So if you picked a correlational study, you want to explain why you picked correlational, but you also want to explain why you did not pick experimental, quasi-experimental, or other types of designs. So for instance, if you picked a correlational design, a reason for not picking experimental is because you're not able to randomly assign participants to conditions or manipulate the variables of interest. And it's worth noting that this applies to the specific research design within the quantitative approach. However, there may be some schools that require you to explain the rationale, not only for the specific research design, but for the larger research approach as well. So you may have to also do this process for explaining why you chose a quantitative research method as opposed to a qualitative research method. And you just include all of the same things that you would say for the research design. You want to say why you selected a quantitative design as opposed to a qualitative or a mixed methods design, and explain why the other designs were not appropriate for your study. Again, you want to look to your specific school's guidelines to see if you need sections on both the general research methodology and the research design, or if you just need to explain the research design. Next, let's talk about the population and sample sections. And this is where a lot of students can get confused because of the differentiation between the population and the sample. A lot of students might think these refer to the same thing, but they're quite different. So the population is the broad group of individuals or people that your results are intended to generalize to. So for instance, if you are in a nursing program and you're doing a study on registered nurses, your population might be, for instance, all registered nurses in the United States. And so for the population section, you want to state what the population is that you are looking at in your study. And if possible, you want to describe the characteristics of the population and provide an estimate of the population size. So for instance, if you are doing that nursing study and your general population is all registered nurses in the United States, you want to find some kind of estimate for how many registered nurses are there in the United States. You might find that, on some websites such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or a similar source that gives estimates for the number of people in a particular workforce, for instance. That kind of information, depending on what your population is, may or may not be available, but if it is, you want to try to provide those estimates and characteristics if you can. So the population is different from the sample, it's because the sample includes only the individuals and people selected from the population who will participate in your study. So if your population is all registered nurses in the United States, your sample is just the few registered nurses that you're able to recruit and get to participate in your study. You can think of the difference between the population and sample in terms of a fishing analogy. So let's say you're going to go fishing and you're going to go out to the lake to go fishing. When you go out fishing, you're probably not going to be able to catch every single fish in the lake. You're only going to be able to catch a few fish. And so the population might be all of the fish in the lake, but your sample would just be the few fish that you catch that day. And so for your sample section, you want to make it very clear who is going to be in your sample and how you're going to pick individuals from the population to be in your sample, or how you're going to invite individuals from the population to be in your study. You'll want to describe the specific sampling strategy or technique that you'll be using. And this is usually divided into either probability-based or random sampling versus non-probability sampling, which includes convenience sampling. And in most studies, a true random sample may or may not be feasible for you to conduct, because a true random sample would mean that every single individual in the population has a chance to be in your study. And for most dissertation level research, that may not be possible. So usually you're going to be using some kind of non-probability or convenience sampling, which means that you are picking a specific target population or subset of the population that is accessible and convenient for you to access. You just want to make it clear exactly what your sampling technique is going to be. So you want to describe how the sample is going to be selected from the population and recruited into your study. So if you're doing that study on registered nurses, how are you going to pick nurses from the population? Are you going to just pick them from a couple of local hospitals or hospitals that you have contacts with? If so, how are you establishing those contacts? How do you get the list of hospitals that you're going to be recruiting from? Once you pick those hospitals, how are you going to get the nurses within those hospitals to participate in your study? Are you going to be sending them emails? If so, how are you going to get their email addresses? Are you going to be working through an administrator in the hospital who will provide those to you? Or are you going to be soliciting their contact information in some other way? You want to be as detailed as possible so that the reader and reviewers know exactly how you are inviting these people to be in your study. And then once you've adequately described how you're going to be recruiting your sample, you want to calculate and state your target sample size. So this is very important in a quantitative study where, depending on the type of analysis you do, you'll want a certain sample size in order for that analysis to have good statistical conclusion validity. And typically for a quantitative analysis, the method of estimating the target sample size is done through a power analysis. So you might use a program such as GPower based on the specific analysis you plan to do, and use that to determine how many people or participants you need in order to conduct that analysis. And I won't go into an incredible amount of detail about power analysis in this presentation, because we do have other webinars that are specifically geared towards power analysis and sample size calculation. So if you do want more information on that part of it, I would refer you to those webinars about sample size. So next, let's talk about the instrumentation. So the instrumentation refers to the different measures that you'll be using to measure the variables of interest in your study. And so you may have a number of variables that you lay out, in your problem purpose, research questions and hypotheses, and you want to make sure that you have a quantitative instrument to measure each one of those variables. And usually in dissertation research, this involves some kind of a survey instrument, but it could involve other types of instruments as well. But for the purposes of our discussion here, we'll be focusing more on survey instruments. So you want to state each instrument that you'll be using to measure each variable. And another important thing to note is that you'll usually want to find an instrument that has already been created by previous researchers and validated by previous researchers, because creating your own instrument can be a very involved process and could be, a dissertation in and of itself. So you usually want to use an instrument that is already available and has already been vetted by the scientific community, rather than trying to create your own unless it's absolutely necessary. And so you want to describe the details of each instrument that you're using. So you want to say, for instance, if it's a survey instrument, how many items or questions are in the instrument, what's the response scale for the instrument. So are participants going to be responding using a Likert scale, like on a 1 to 5 scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, or are they responding in some other way? And you want to talk about the scoring for the instrument as well. So say you have an instrument that assesses self-esteem, and it consists of 10 questions. So how are you going to take those 10 questions and get a score for self-esteem? Or how are you going to operationalize your self-esteem variable from that instrument? Are you going to take the 10 items and average them together to get an overall score, or are you using the instrument and scoring it in some other way? Usually the instrument authors will provide instructions for how to score the instrument. So you want to give the details on how the specific instrument will be scored and how you will arrive at the values for the variable that you'll be using for each analysis. And in addition to describing the instrument, you want to provide evidence for the instrument's validity and reliability. And this goes back to using instruments that have already been validated in the research. Because if you try to create your own instrument, that means you are the one who has to, run analyses and do the work to establish the validity for the instrument. And that can be a very involved process. But if you're using an instrument that's already been created, you just have to look to the literature and present the evidence that supports the use of that instrument and establishes that that instrument is a valid and reliable measure. So usually this information is found in the article that describes the original development of the instrument. And typically for validity, you might look to something like a factor analysis. So the authors may describe a factor analysis to establish the validity of the instrument. And for reliability, the authors would probably use a reliability coefficient such as a Cronbach's alpha to document the reliability of the instrument. Again, you should be able to find this information in the original article that describes how the instrument was first created and developed. So next, let's talk about the data collection and analysis procedures. So starting with the data collection procedures, you want to describe step by step how your data are going to be collected. And again, going back to our previous point, this should be detailed enough so that your study can be repeated by others if they read your methodology chapter. Someone should be able to read your data collection procedures and be able to repeat exactly what you are proposing to do. So you want to, again, be as detailed as possible in terms of where and how the data collection will take place. So if you're doing a simple survey study, you may be doing it just as an online survey. So you want to specify if you're doing an online survey, what where are you going to be hosting the online survey? Are you going to be using a service like SurveyMonkey or some other service? If you're doing the survey in person, where exactly are you going to be uh, administering or distributing the survey? Or are you going to be mailing the survey to people? Or how are you going to be distributing this survey? You want to indicate how the participants are going to provide informed consent. So if you're doing any study that involves human participants, you're going to want to include a process for informed consent. And usually this just means giving participants information about the study before you collect any data from them so that they're informed about what the study is about and what their participation involves so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not they should be participating. And participants should indicate that they consent to participate before they answer any questions or before you collect any other data from them. And if you're doing an online survey study, usually this just involves putting a page on the first page of your survey that presents the informed consent information and has an item that participants endorse to indicate that they understand the study and they agree to participate. You also want to provide details about how and when each instrument will be administered. And this is particularly important if you're doing some kind of longitudinal or repeated measures study that involves collecting the data at multiple points in time. So if you have a study like that, you want to be very specific about how many times is each instrument going to be administered and when exactly are you going to be administering the instruments. After you establish your data collection procedures, you want to talk about your data analysis plan. So the data collection procedures would cover basically everything up until you have the data collected and are ready to analyze the data. Now is when your data analysis plan comes in. So you have the data, what are you going to do with it? First, you want to describe how the data are going to be compiled or entered into an electronic format so that you could use a statistical analysis program to work with it. And this is particularly important if you are doing an in-person survey or doing some kind of paper and pencil data collection where you actually have to enter the responses into an electronic format from paper and pencil surveys, for instance. However, if you're doing an online survey study, it's probably going to be the case that you can just download the data already in an electronic format. So this process won't be as involved. You'll want to state the specific software that you plan to use for any data cleaning and analysis. So for instance, SPSS. And you want to describe how exactly you're going to clean and prepare the data for the analysis. So this can involve checking the data for accuracy, checking the data for outliers, and dealing with missing data points. So the checking for data for accuracy is more geared towards if you had to do manual data entry from paper and pencil surveys, you want to check that data to make sure you didn't make any mistakes when you're entering the data, or there are no errors, or there are no values that are completely out of range from what you would expect. You want to check the data for outliers, and you also want to have a plan for dealing with missing data. So it's very likely that you'll collect your data and some responses will be missing for one reason or another. Could be that some participants decided to just stop the survey early, or there may be other reasons for why someone may be missing data for one or more questions. So you want to have a very specific plan for how you are going to deal with missing responses. Are you going to just exclude or remove anyone who is missing any responses and only include people who answered every question? Are you going to try to include some people who may be missing some responses? And if so, how are you going to deal with those missing values? Are you going to replace or impute them in some way? Or are you going to handle the missing responses in some other way? You just want to have a very clear plan for how you are going to deal with that. Then after you describe all the data cleaning and preparation, you want to talk about the actual analyses that you plan to do. And this can start with just some basic descriptive analyses. So you want to state any descriptive statistics that you're going to conduct on your variables, whether they're the main variables in your study or just demographic variables that you're using to describe your sample. And then you want to describe the analysis that you will use to answer each research question or hypothesis. And you want to just put this in a logical order. You can describe it one by one in order of how your research questions and hypotheses are listed. So if you have 3 research questions, you state research question 1 and say, to answer research question 1, I'm going to do this analysis. And to answer research question 2, I'm going to do this analysis. So you want to be very specific about that. So you'll want to describe the analysis that you're going to be doing to answer each question and the appropriate statistics that you're going to be computing that goes along with each of those analyses. And for each analysis that you do, you also want to describe the assumptions for each of those tests. So if you're doing any inferential statistical tests like t-tests or ANOVAs or regressions, there are going to be some statistical assumptions that need to be met in order to conduct those analyses. And so for each statistical analysis you plan to do, you'll need to describe those assumptions and how you're going to test them. So for instance, if you're doing a t-test, you may have to test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. So you'll want to state those assumptions, state how you're going to test each of those assumptions, and have a plan for what you're going to do if any of those assumptions are violated. So for instance, if the assumptions of the t-test are violated, you might propose running a non-parametric t-test instead. So one of the later sections of the chapter can be the limitations section. And this is a section that may or may not be required depending on the your specific school's requirements, but a lot of schools are requiring a section on limitations. And this differs maybe from the limitations section that might come earlier in your paper, such as in your introduction section, because in the methodology chapter, the limitations specifically refer to methodological limitations or limitations of the specific research design. So you'll want to talk about specific limitations that are associated with the research design and this even the specific data analysis and collection procedures that you have chosen. So for instance, if you're doing a correlational study, one of the main limitations is that you cannot determine cause and effect from a correlational study. If you're doing any kind of survey research, you can talk about specific response biases such as social desirability bias that may affect the results of survey research. If you're doing any kind of longitudinal or repeated measure study, like a pre-post study, there are a number of limitations you can talk about, such as attrition, testing effects, history, and maturation. And then if you're doing an experimental study, you may want to talk about limitations in terms of external validity. So how well are the results of your experiment going to generalize to the real world? And then usually one of the last, if not the last section of the methodology chapter is the ethical considerations or ethical issues. And so in this section, you want to describe all of the ethical issues that are relevant to your study and how you are going to be protecting um, the study participants. And this usually starts with a discussion of the Belmont Report principles, and some schools may require you to specifically discuss the main Belmont Report principles, which are um, beneficence, justice, and respect for persons, and describe how you are going to ensure that you follow each of those principles. You'll want to talk about getting institutional review board or IRB approval. So pretty much any study that you do is going to require approval from an IRB. And so you'll want to describe that you will be getting that IRB approval before you collect any data. You'll want to talk about the informed consent process, especially if you didn't already describe that in your data collection procedures. And you want to talk about the risks involved in the study. So a lot of students will make the mistake of saying that their study doesn't involve any risk, but that's not really true because all studies involve some kind of risk. Although, if you're doing a very simple, online survey study, for instance, maybe the risk is minimal, but you never want to say that your study has no risk. Whether your study has minimal or more than minimal risk, you want to say what those potential risks are and how those risks are going to be mitigated. How are you going to protect your participants? And this becomes, even more important if your study involves more than minimal risk. If your study involves more than minimal risk, you'll want to be very detailed um, in describing exactly what those risks are and what procedures you're going to be following to minimize those risks as much as possible, and even justifying um, why the benefits of your study outweigh those risks. In that same vein, you also want to discuss how participants' identities and information is going to be protected. So you want to describe how you're going to ensure either anonymity or confidentiality. So anonymity would be if you don't know anything about the participants' identities and you aren't collecting any personally identifying information from the participants. Um, what are the procedures you're going to be using to ensure that you keep those responses anonymous? If you do have to collect personally identifying information for some reason, such as if you have to have access to participants' email addresses in order to recruit them into the study, how are you going to keep that information confidential and secure? And finally, you want to talk about the storage of the data and the information from the participants. So how are the data going to be stored? If you're just dealing with electronic data, so if you're doing a fully online survey and only have electronic data, are you storing these data on a password protected computer or some kind of encrypted storage? If you have actual physical copies of the data, like paper and pencil surveys, where is that going to be stored? Are you going to be storing it in some kind of or some secure location? And then after the study is over, how are the data going to be disposed of? Typically, schools will have requirements for how long you should keep the data after you've completed your study, and then um, you'll want to describe that process and how you're going to destroy the data once that period is over. And so that does it for the different components of the chapter. Again, here is some information in case you are interested in support outside of this webinar. So you can feel free to contact us if you're interested in more one-on-one help. But now that we've gone through all the components of the chapter, I'll start answering questions. So if you do have any questions at this time, you can feel free to put those into the question section. I'll go ahead and see if we have any questions so far. All right, so I have one question secondary data. So for secondary analysis of 2 previous studies, do I describe my methods and the methods of the previous studies? Is there any specific section content that I should add to the methods chapter for a secondary analysis study? So this is a good question. So if you are doing a secondary analysis, or in other words, looking at archival or pre-existing data, the things that you describe in the methodology chapter will be a little bit different. Instead of focusing on the how you're going to be collecting the data, because the data are already collected, you want to focus more on how you are gaining access to that data and using that data. So it may be the case that this data is just public and posted somewhere. So you just want to describe exactly where it's posted, how you're accessing it, those kinds of details. But it may also be the case that you have to contact some organization or data manager to get access to this pre-existing data. And so you'll want to describe that process in as much detail as possible and describe all of the proper permissions that you need to secure in order to use that data for your research. It may also be the case that you'll need to describe a little bit about the original data collection procedures. So you probably don't need to go into a ton of detail about how the original data were collected, not as much detail as you would go into if you were conducting a primary data collection study. But you may want to just give kind of a brief description of how the original data were collected, just so the reader has a sense of where the data came from, and things of that nature. So to answer that question, you do want to describe kind of both of those aspects, both how the data were originally collected and how you are accessing the data, but you want to focus more on how you are accessing that archival data and how you're going to be using it. Okay, let's see if we have some more questions here. Question is using Excel to perform statistical tests acceptable? I did correlation, coefficient, scatter plots, and t-tests that way. You can use Excel to do certain analyses. Excel definitely has an analysis package in it that allows you to run those types of tests. So you definitely can use Excel for that. There's no reason why the results from Excel wouldn't be valid compared to something that you would run in SPSS or another program, because generally with statistical software, as long as the analysis that you're doing is exactly the same, the data that you're using is the same, and all of the parameters and variables and everything are the same, all else being equal, the results that you get from one software program are going to be the same as the results that you get from another. So it's not like the math between any 2 programs will be different. So it is acceptable to use Excel if that's what you have access to, and it can perform the specific analysis that you need to do. So another question about archival data: are there risks with de-identified archival data? So this again goes more to the specific procedures for how you're accessing the data. Is it public? If you're getting your data from a secured source where you need to go through somebody and get permission for it, there can be some risks or procedures associated with that, because regardless, you want to make sure, especially if you're getting your data from a non-public source, that you have procedures in place to ensure confidentiality, so that you agree that you're using this data just for your own research. You're not going to share it with anybody else. So there may be considerations in that regard. If it's completely de-identified anonymous data, there's less concern, about your risks to participants. But again, I would steer away from saying that a study doesn't have any risk, because pretty much all studies have some kind of risk. It's just to the extent that there might be risk in specific studies. So let's see what other questions we have here. So we have a question. I'm conducting an RCT, so randomized controlled trial, as part of a multi-center trial. We will only recruit local participants, as they must come on site. Would this still be considered convenient sampling? Does the fact that we have multiple centers improve sampling, or is that not relevant here? So in a way, this would be kind of a form of convenient sampling, because you are recruiting participants who are readily accessible to you, rather than recruiting from randomly from the general population. And again, this also depends on exactly what your population of interest is for this study. It could be that your population of interest is just this specific locale, in which case your sample may be more representative than if your population that you're trying to generalize to is more broad than that. But really, anytime you're not completely randomly inviting participants from the population or the larger population, what you'd be doing would be some kind of non-probability sampling. I think it maybe does strengthen things if you're taking things from multiple institutions or centers, but it doesn't really change the fact that you're still recruiting participants in a way that you're selecting sites that are accessible to you, rather than picking people completely at random from the broader population. So let's see for other questions. So I have a question. If you're doing DIP research, do you still have to provide reliability and the validity of the instrumentation? I'm not precisely sure what DIP stands for in this case, but generally, if you're doing any kind of academic research study, and you're using survey instruments or any other kind of instruments to quantitatively measure variables or constructs, you would have to provide reliability and validity information for those specific instruments. A dissertation in practice, okay. But yeah, I think the same thing still applies. If you're using some kind of pre-existing instrument to measure a variable of interest, then you probably want to provide information about the validity and reliability of that instrument. But again, and this applies to pretty much everything in the methodology chapter, is specific schools or degree programs will have their own requirements for what exactly you need to describe and present in the methodology chapter. So you should always defer to what exactly your school is requiring, because again, what we're presenting here is just the sections and information that's typical for a quantitative dissertation, but the specific requirements for your degree program may be slightly different. So definitely check on your specific guidelines and see what information um, your your school or your degree program is requiring. And another good resource in terms of figuring out what information is appropriate to include in your methodology section would be previously completed, you know, dissertations or papers from students who have, you know, recently graduated the program. So if you have access to those, you can look at those papers of students who have recently graduated and see what types of information they had in their chapters. And if that, you know, if those are students who graduated from your degree program, you can kind of use those as exemplars for what your school and your reviewers are going to be looking for that chapter. Okay, so I think that may be all of the questions that have been submitted thus far. If anybody else has any other questions, you feel free to type those in now. So the question is, if you're measuring something like change in body weight, would you reference the SOP followed in the instrumentation section? Is there anything else that we should think of for these physical measurements? So this is a good question, because it does differ from the typical, you know, survey research. If you're actually doing physical measurements like weight and height and things like that, you do still want to give, you know, as specific information as possible in terms of what instruments you're using to obtain those measurements. So that could even come down to, you know, the specific, like, brand and model of scale that you're using, for instance, to get somebody's weight. Um, so if you have information that specific about the instruments you're using, like, you know, the exact, you know, type of scale, like the model and the brands that you're using to weigh the participants, then you should include that information and include that type of information for any other, you know, physical instrument as well. And if, you know, it's more than just the device itself, but the procedures used to obtain the measurement, then you should describe those procedures in as much detail as possible. Okay, so if anyone else has any other questions, you can feel free to type those questions in now. And I'll just wait another minute or two, see if anybody else has any other questions before we end the session for today. Yes, the PowerPoint slides will be available, as well as the recording of the session itself will be available on our website after um, the presentation. So those will be available on the website later. Okay, it doesn't look like I'm getting any more questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end the session for today. And we do have other um, webinars available, so I think that information has been posted if you're interested in additional webinars on other topics. We also repeat this specific webinar on a monthly basis, so if you're interested in sitting in on more webinars about the quantitative methodology. If you have more questions later, you're welcome to attend our future webinars. But otherwise, I hope that everyone found this useful today. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, and I hope everyone has a great day.